Xìngxiàng had always maintained a respectful distance when it came to the fights between female characters, but having observed this, he felt like the gap between his expectations and reality was too great to ignore. He hurried out after them, continuing to observe. "I'm sorry I neglected my duties," Qing Wanyuan said while holding back tears. "I didn't stop the little palace mistress." Sha Hualing swiftly cut her off. "It was entirely your fault. I've heard that saving faces is especially important to human realm women, but even though you failed to seduce the Lord many times, you shamelessly refused to leave, so that's all your face amounts to. Moreover, not leaving is one thing, but you can't even keep a proper eye on a single person. You're her martial sister, so her cultivation is inferior to yours, yet you didn't stop her and even let her throw a tantrum before the Lord. Who are you humiliating yourself and acting pitiful for?" Listening to Sha Hualing point out her inadequacies to her face, Qing Wanyue wanted to die of shame and resentment. In the original work, Sha Hualing had deeply hated Qing Wanyue and always found fault with her, and it seemed that though they hadn't entered the harem together this time, their relationship hadn't improved in the slightest. Sha Hualing then turned her head and swapped out her entire expression. She spoke to the little palace mistress while full of smiles. These past few years, the little palace mistress has lived a life of luxury just like she did before. Other than the occasional house arrest, you suffered no real mistreatment, right? So why are you so aggrieved?" "Who the hell are you?" the little palace mistress asked viciously. "How dare you, an indecent, vixen, seductress from heaven knows where, speaking like that to me in Huahua Palace? How is the way he treats me any different from a kept pig?" Sha Hualing pouted. "Then why doesn't the little palace mistress tell me? What else can she do other than eat, sleep like the animals she brought up?" Qing Wanyue sobbed. "Little palace mistress, let's go. Everything has long since changed." "On what grounds are you making me leave?" the little palace mistress said hysterically. "This is my Huahua Palace, mine. Get out of my way. Traitors, the lot of you." The scene fell into complete chaos, with people sent flying every which way. Shìngxiàng had discovered a most shocking truth. He carefully counted on his fingers. Sha Hualing was not made a wife, but a subordinate, toils to death on overtime, and her pay and benefits are nothing to write home about. From her boss's attitude, doesn't look like he wants an office romance either. Tick. Liu Mingyan didn't even exchange the sword tassel love token. Tick. Ning Yingying, after puberty, stopped demonstrating the fanatical love from her naive youth towards the male lead. Seems like her lovesick brain's been cured. Tick. The little palace mistress, bitter, locked-up woman. She herself said that Luo Binghe treats her like a kept pig. Tick. Qing Wanyue, bitter, locked-up woman, the sequel, failed at offering herself countless times, moonlights as the little palace mistress's nanny. Tick. Qiu Haitang, after dragging Shìngxiàng down, she's supposedly to be happily going down to Cocktown with Luo Binghe. Why is she still wandering about homeless? Tick. The 3 Taoist nuns, a second in the spotlight, hello and goodbye. Tick, tick, tick. Looking down this list, Luo Binghe had really ended up in an awful state. As a hale and hearty male lead of a stallion novel, are you doing okay or not? A perfectly good harem had been broken down to the point that it was coughing up smoke. If this were a novel and the plot had unfolded to this point without the protagonist collecting a single wife, what satisfaction points were there to be had? Xìngxiàng promptly called up the system to check the various categories' point values. Unexpectedly, he discovered that, beneath the B points, the protagonist satisfaction points not only hadn't decreased, they had actually risen to over 900. Because many of the points had been added while the system was offline and hibernating, he hadn't received the notifications. Xìngxiàng prodded open the many new windows providing detailed calculations that he'd unknowingly received. Lined up within them were a bunch of new records. Ning Ying Ying subverted the trope of a female character being a brainless martyr for love, B points plus 100. Ming Fan subverted the trope of a side character being an illogical idiot, B points plus 50. Liu Mingyan subverted the trope of a female character being a nonsensical martyr for love, B points plus 50. The ubiquitous love martyr female characters and idiot cannon fodder, these 2 points together constituted the classic landmine elements of stallion novels. Now the female characters weren't relationship-based martyrs for the male lead, and the side characters' EQs and IQs had also risen, so naturally the B points had risen too. This Xìngxiàng understood. But while Luo Binghe hadn't betted a single girl, the system hadn't deducted any of his satisfaction points. That part was unscientific. Could it be that, currently, the male lead's satisfaction points were no longer bound to the male lead himself? Or, to say it another way, what determined the male lead's satisfaction no longer lay in such pleasures? Could it be? Xìngxiàng couldn't resist the urge to raise his eyes and take in Luo Binghe's dismal expression. He suddenly felt that he couldn't stare straight at him anymore. It was criminal. Could it be that he'd raised an otherwise totally fine stallion novel male lead to be asexual? Xìngxiàng closed the windows, his feelings complicated. Then he realized that something about his location didn't seem quite right. Just now, he'd definitely been in Huanghua Palace, minding his own business, so how had he ended up walking into a forested grove without noticing? And regardless of how he studied it, it was a strikingly familiar-looking bamboo forest. The bamboo forest rustled as a gentle breeze blew through it. Xìngxiàng didn't even need to guess the identity of the location. Even if he had been shown only a corner of this place, he'd know where he was. Changqiong Mountain, Qingjing Peak. How could he be familiar with the place where he'd thus far holed up for the longest period of time in this life? System. Your current location, the land of Luo Binghe's dream realm. When Luo Binghe's consciousness was unstable and its fluctuations were especially large, outsiders were often affected, sucked into a dream realm that was as vast as a deep-sea vortex. Or, you could say, they became collateral damage for Luo Binghe's incomparably huge black hole of an imagination. For a specific example, please see the beginning of Menmo's instance from way back when. Xìngxiàng had run through the Menmo scenario with Luo Binghe at the time. This was operating on the same principle as, quote, strangers the first time but familiar the second, unquote. It was similar to how, after connecting to a Wi-Fi network once, the second time you would connect automatically without needing to enter the password. Xìngxiàng quickly touched his own face and found no beard. Within the dream realm, he'd returned to his original appearance, leaving him with absolutely no sense of security. Just as he was thinking of finding a place to hide and wait for Luo Binghe to awaken by himself, some disciples walked toward him in 2s and 3s, and Xìngxiàng jerked to a halt, wholly forgetting to conceal himself. The problem was that, although the expressions on these coming and going disciples were slightly wooden, every single one had noses and eyes, their facial features complete. Xìngxiàng could even name quite a few. Not even Mengmo was able to simultaneously support a vast barrier while guaranteeing the facial features of the life forms within. Yet, Luo Binghe could already do it, and to such a great level of detail. Though Xìngxiàng had long known that Luo Binghe's OP-ness could eclipse the heavens, he still couldn't help but let out a sigh. Amazing. After exiting the little bamboo forest, he came upon Xìngxiàng Peak's bamboo house. Between the scattered stalks of bamboo, some tall and some short, spring water flowed in a rush, tinkling rhythmically and reflecting the sunlight in a rainbow of colors. Xìngxiàng was worried that Luo Binghe was inside the house and halted his steps. Having strolled this bamboo forest countless times while idling about, he easily found a place to hide and came to a stop within the shadows. Suddenly, there came the sound of footsteps on fallen leaves, and from within the overlapping verdant bamboo, out walked a youth in white, 15 or 16 years of age. This youth's skin was fair, and he appeared to have run all the way here. A layer of sweat covered his forehead, while his cheeks were rosy, which made for an incredible, adorable sight. The line of his eyes and brows were precise without being sharp, and they radiated a sense of youthful inexperience. Xìngxiàng mourned despite himself. It had been a long time since he'd seen the youthful Luo Binghe, that small, refreshing son. While cultivating on Xìngxiàng Peak, Luo Binghe had liked to wear white, but after his rebellious phase began, the devil incarnate Luo Binghe had come to wear only black, pretty much the polar opposite of before. This youthful tenderness was even more a memory, and it was no longer in evidence at all. Luo Binghe strode forward, calling out in high spirits, "Shizun!" Xìngxiàng was hidden in the shadows, so naturally this call wasn't for him. He turned his gaze, and as expected, he saw a form in teal robes standing at the far end of the cobblestone path. The, quote, Xìngxiàng, forged from memories in the dream realm, stood in the midst of a stretch of verdant, flourishing bamboo. His figure was slender, like unto a thin stalk of bamboo himself, and his expression was unperturbed, radiating the cool aura of an immortal, while his poise was veritably somewhat otherworldly. As a bystander, the current Xìngxiàng judged him from head to toe and still had to applaud. To be able to fake it to this level, he was really too superb. Also, that Luo Binghe could perfectly restore all these tiny details, as expected of the man who would personally succeed Mengmo. That Xìngxiàng in the midst of the bamboo appeared to have been lost in thought. He cocked his head and asked, "Finished running?" Luo Binghe nodded. 10 laps, all finished." Xìngxiàng finally remembered what slice of memory this was. The quote 10 laps Luo Binghe spoke of referred to 10 laps around the fence encircling Xìngxiàng Peak. Xìngxiàng had personally assigned him this task. He hadn't done it because he had a twisted hobby of inflicting corporal punishment upon the great male lead, but because he just couldn't endure it any longer. After taking over Luo Binghe's education, he'd mulled it over and decided that since he was to be a role model and a worthy teacher, he ought to at least do some proper teaching. This way, after they fell out in the future, he would be able to utter the phrase, quote, "Within a master-disciple relationship lies the grace of knowledge passed down," unquote, without reddening from shame before the words left his mouth. In his course curriculum, the first thing to correct was the absolute mess that was Luo Binghe's footwork and form. As for the results, he'd mentioned it a while back. The most significant outcome was that Luo Binghe had repeatedly fallen into his arms for half a month. Once more, said Xìngxiàng. If you get it wrong this time, it won't be only 10 laps. Luo Binghe obediently performed the maneuver once more, while he certainly didn't fall into Xìngxiàng's arms this time. Instead, his legs buckled and he ended up directly embracing Xìngxiàng's waist. Xìngxiàng was silent. Shizun, this disciple is useless, Luo Binghe said bashfully. After 10 laps, my legs have no strength. Xìngxiàng sighed. This disciple knows, Luo Binghe said, fully aware. 20 laps. What laps? Go back and rest. Xìngxiàng had no interest in abusing children. At that time, he'd truly given up. Let him do whatever he wants, no more teaching. There's no sense of accomplishment whatsoever. I'm throwing out the textbooks. Luo Binghe failed to realize that he'd been declared a hopeless case. Thank you, Shizun, he said in high spirits. This disciple will absolutely make up the 20 laps tomorrow. Is there anything Shizun would like to eat tonight? To the side, Xìngxiàng rubbed his forehead. Luo Binghe in those days had genuinely been naive and sweet to an exceptional degree. Enduring labor, resentment, beatings, and verbal abuse, being stepped on, kicked, and made to cook. Of course, Xìngxiàng hadn't done most of those things. After watching this artificial master-disciple pair, one tall and one short, walk off while conversing, Xìngxiàng came out of his hiding place and lapsed into bewilderment. Within the dream realm barrier Luo Binghe had constructed for himself, he would naturally choose to relive only his most wonderful memories. If any memory of Qingjing Peak could occupy such a niche, they should have been the ones related to Ningyin. So why had this one played out? The dream realm precisely reflected the truth of a person's heart. It would neither lie nor deceive. Within Xìngxiàng welled up a thought he'd never had before. This thought was admittedly a bit shameless, but probably, maybe, possibly, those memories of this master-disciple relationship occupied a better place in Luo Binghe's heart than Xìngxiàng had thought. At the very least, it could be said that he'd given Luo Binghe a couple of moments that were decent enough to look back on. So perhaps the entire thing hadn't been completely unbearable. However, was Luo Binghe a bit of a masochist? Xìngxiàng didn't want to badmouth him, but normally a memory about being punished with 10 or 20 laps could never have anything to do with the word, quote, wonderful, right? Suddenly, a trace of chilly air unfurled over Xìngxiàng's nape, as if a gaze both hot and cold were crawling upward along his back. He unconsciously looked behind him. Luo Binghe, clothed in black, was leaning against a stalk of bamboo and staring straight at him. The two of them stared at each other without speaking. In the flesh? In the flesh! Xìngxiàng's initial reflex wasn't to make a break for it, but to remain in place unmoving and adjust his expression to be as natural as possible. This wasn't because he was scared stiff with legs too weak to run, more that he'd long since psychologically prepared himself to enter this kind of scenario. Running couldn't solve the problem at all. This barrier was Luo Binghe's home field, so he could run as fast as he could and it'd still be pointless. That gaze being simultaneously hot and cold hadn't been his imagination, nor was it a mistaken description. Luo Binghe's expression really did seem like it was both ice and fire, a deep chill within as well as a burning heat. The two temperatures combined bizarrely and condensed within his eyes, which were locked securely on Xìngxiàng's form. Xìngxiàng braced himself, letting their eyes meet. After a long while, Luo Binghe sighed first. He murmured, "Being able to dream is a wonderful thing." When Xìngxiàng heard this, he realized that he'd managed to get away with his risky maneuver. By summoning his courage, he'd actually won the gamble. At this moment, Luo Binghe's absent-mindedness had enabled Xìngxiàng to be taken as a dream realm creation. Xìngxiàng studied Luo Binghe leaning against the bamboo, stare fixed on himself. He thought of Luo Binghe's numb appearance on the throne earlier that day, or alone. When he compared that to the scene in the original work of Luo Binghe, surrounded by splendid luxuries, his every call answered by hundreds, Xìngxiàng's heart throbbed a bit, though he tried to stop it. Luo Binghe didn't have a single wife by his side to heal his injuries, to pamper and ask after him. How could his heart not throb? A perfectly fine stallion novel male lead had fallen to such a state. What man could bear to look? Shizun, won't you speak with me a little? Luo Binghe asked. At this moment, Xìngxiàng's heart was full of sympathy for Luo Binghe. All right, he said amicably. What do you want to talk about? When he spoke, Luo Binghe unexpectedly went rigid, then straightened at once and left the bamboo stalk, the expression on his face out of slight disbelief. Oh no, Xìngxiàng thought. Was something amiss in the reaction I came up with? But since he'd already started acting, he had to act until the end. He absolutely couldn't give up halfway. Embarrassment was a small thing. Blowing his cover was not. Xìngxiàng smiled. Didn't you ask this master to speak with you? He used the tone he'd often deploy in the past when interacting with Luo Binghe. The corner of Luo Binghe's mouth twitched, and he unhurriedly walked toward him. Xìngxiàng kept his expression steady while casually and gently opening and closing the folding fan in his hand, using the small movements to alleviate his anxiety. Luo Binghe was silent for a moment. In the past, Shizun wouldn't even glance my way and would walk off without paying me heed. Forget about talking to me. Perhaps my imagination today is a little too indulgent. Xìngxiàng's heart stirred. Though he still felt that something was off, these words really did sound a tad pitiful. Could it be that within Luo Binghe's mind, quote, Xìngxiàng always treated him with indifference and was lofty and unfeeling? Luo Binghe really did have some slight masochistic tendencies, huh? As Xìngxiàng thought this, in his distraction, his hand unconsciously began to move, and, in accordance with the natural order, he patted the top of Luo Binghe's head. He'd performed this action countless times. The saying went that it was forbidden to touch men's heads and women's waists, but the more something was forbidden, the more he felt the urge to do it. Xìngxiàng especially loved patting people's heads. Unfortunately, as a grown adult, he couldn't often indulge this sort of rude impulse, and moreover, no one would let him touch them however he wanted. Luckily, the Luo Binghe of the past hadn't minded when Xìngxiàng placed his hands on his head, so Xìngxiàng had aimlessly patted him whenever, until it had eventually become a habit, and now he was doing it again. He had barely patted Luo Binghe 2 or 3 times when he was caught off guard. Luo Binghe lifted his own arm, his right hand, grasping Xìngxiàng's left waist. Xìngxiàng's expression stiffened as he thought, isn't this a bit too close? Straight after, his right wrist had been firmly captured as well. Lifting his head in shock, Xìngxiàng felt his vision blur. Something like a feather delicately brushed his cheek. From on top of his lips came a foreign sensation, soft and slightly cool. In this way, his eyes opened wide, and he met gazes with Luo Binghe's pair of pitch-black irises. His throat bobbed once, with difficulty. He wanted to speak, but he couldn't open his mouth, because someone was biting down on his lips. Luo Binghe shut his eyes, his jet-black eyelashes casting curved shadows on his cheeks. It made him look incredibly endearing, but his hands and mouth were a totally different story. He angrily held Xìngxiàng's lips between his teeth, chomping, the action carrying a hint of childish resentfulness. His right hand released Xìngxiàng's frozen limb and moved to the center of his waist instead, pressing Xìngxiàng into his arms. Even though their builds were similar, he could still entirely enfold Xìngxiàng with a simple, one-armed embrace. Xìngxiàng's worldview repeatedly collapsed and reformed, cycling infinitely at the speed of light. What broke through his breakdown was a system notification accompanied by celebratory background music. Satisfaction points plus 500. Congratulations, congratulations, congratulations. Important things must be said 3 times. What the fuck? Xìngxiàng snapped in his head. He finally understood why, even though Luo Binghe hadn't slept with a single girl, even though neither hide nor hair could be seen of his innumerable harem of beauties, his satisfaction points had never fallen. Because he'd used Xìngxiàng to make up for his deficit.